Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Founder Spirit podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Wu. In this podcast series, I interview exceptional individuals from all over the world with the Founder Spirit, ranging from social entrepreneurs to tech founders, philanthropists, elite athletes, and more. Together, we'll uncover not only how they manage to succeed in face of multiple challenges, but also who they are as people and their human story.
I think very early on, it was clear that I was not that talented at anything. And so I grew up very much believing that I wasn't a very creative person. And if anything, I was just absolutely average at most things. I do think that holding a camera, it changes the way you see and navigate and interact with the world. The environmental movement really has somewhat of a crisis of imagination. We struggle to even believe that change is possible anymore, and we kind of just settle into apathy. We struggle to even believe that change is possible anymore, and we kind of just settle into apathy. Because I think by creating art that helps support just and equitable transition, that is inspiring and surprising, we can actually help give people hope and momentum and highlight something that we can all be excited to work towards.
Joining us today is the methodical Benjamin von Wong, a world-class photographer, multi-disciplinary artist, and activist, known for his visually stunning and impactful projects that highlight critical issues around social justice and climate change. Trained as an engineer, he seamlessly blends artistry with catalytic action and collaboration. Completely self-taught, his artworks have generated over 100 million views on topics like ocean plastics, fast fashion, and electronic waste. Supported by organizations such as Greenpeace, Nike, Starbucks, and Dell, Benjamin also holds a Guinness World Record for the largest art installation made from plastic straws. How did a former mining engineer who bought his first camera at age 21 become a world-class photographer and artist? Well, let's talk to him and find out. Hello, Ben. Welcome to the Founder Spirit podcast. Great to have you on the show today, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Benjamin, as a child, I was told that you were not particularly artistic.
Nope.
And in fact, no one from your family thought you were going to become an artist. So what were some of your formative experiences and adventures?
So I grew up in a lower income household for the most part. My parents were fairly poor, first generation immigrants, doing multiple jobs when I was growing up. And yet they believed in giving us every single opportunity possible. So starting from 3 years old, I had violin lessons, as every good Asian family tries to give to their kids. And then I dove into martial arts. I picked up drawing lessons of all kinds, dabbled in pottery, ceramics, you name it. My parents tried to put me in it, not because they thought I had any talent, but just that it would be healthy for me to try different things. And I think very early on, it was clear that I was not that talented at anything. And so I grew up very much believing that I wasn't a very creative person. And if anything, I was just absolutely average at most things.
You know, I had a similar story from my side. I never thought I was creative. Yeah. You also come from a Chinese Malaysian family in Montreal, Canada. How do you think growing up in a multicultural environment influenced your trajectory?
I went to 13 different schools in 3 different countries in 3 different languages. So I spent a lot of my youth traveling around. I think growing up in Montreal, I was kind of the Chinese person. When I was in the US, I was the Asian guy. But then when I went to China, I was kind of the Canadian guy. And so basically my experience was one of kind of not really fitting in, of always being somewhat of a third culture kid that didn't necessarily belong. And I think there's some benefits to that. The major ones being that you kind of approach the world with a lot more curiosity to try to figure out where these commonalities actually lie. And over time, I just became really good at making new friends and being really good at saying goodbye. So I can dance through different worlds a lot easier, I think, as a byproduct of that. I think similarly, just from a values perspective, kind of like gone through a number of different educational systems. And in doing so, maybe picked up the values of different places and spaces. I think the ones that the one that particularly influenced me were probably the values of community. So much pride around community and showing up for people has kind of ingrained into my personality today.
That's wonderful to hear. As mentioned, you bought your first camera at age 21 while you were still working as a mining engineer. How did you eventually uncover or discover your true passion as a photographer?
Yeah, so I mean, I started off photography the same way I started off many other hobbies. I just bought a camera and decided to do it after a girl broke up with me while I was working in the desert in Nevada. And I just remember sitting down at the Starbucks reading the user manual because I had like no idea how to use it. That hobby just kind of grew, probably because at the time I was a little bit lonely. And the camera was sort of like a companion that I could bring with me anywhere I went. It was like a travel companion. And over time, I started finding like photo clubs. I found like a community to support me. I quickly became better. I think there's something also about the timing in which I picked up photography that was pretty significant because I picked up photography in 2007, 2008, right at the rise of Facebook. And so I was taking photos, I was putting them online, and my friends, they were complimenting it or talking about where I was or how cool things were. And that gave like a positive feedback loop for me to want to create more. And so the like sort of digital feedback loop, the ability to like start a fan page, all these factors just allowed me to grow super quickly. It just felt very motivating to continuously improve. And I think in the early days of Facebook, things were so beautiful. I think like you would find people with similar hobbies and share them in these groups, and there's this really like collaborative energy to whatever you were interested in. And I think you can still find it, but it was just very, very prominent at that time. So it was just very like positive cycle that really helped me get very good very quickly. But I think it's something you don't need to have talent to do it. You can actually just pick it up because the feedback loop is so tight. The best way to become a better photographer is just to take more photos. Like I took 10,000 photos in the first year. You can put that 10,000 hour rule into practice.
And as you became quickly better at photographer, do you recall the moment when you first realized that this could be a viable career path? Was it under a particular circumstance? Was it through a series of photos?
Yeah.
When did you realize that you could do this for a living?
It was kind of interesting. I had sort of had the reverse experience, which is I had a day job as a hard rock mining engineer, and photography was clearly a hobby. I still remember it. In the first 6 months, someone in my photography club couldn't make it to a gig and asked if I wanted to do it. And I was paid $250 to photograph a party for 6 hours. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just got paid to have fun. This is amazing. Like, I should keep doing this. And so I started marketing myself as an event photographer, looking for little opportunities to make money. And then with that money, I could buy more gear. And photography is kind of a gear heavy thing, especially in the beginning. And slowly grew my business. And within the first year, like generated $10,000. So that sort of positive cycle started picking up momentum. By year 2, I just remember having this moment where I was just like, oh my gosh, I have 2 jobs now. I have photography and engineering, and that wasn't the plan. And so I actually quit my photography job because I was like, I just want to have a job and a hobby. And I decided to like pull out of weddings and events and switch over to doing more fantastical and surreal things. So my first step into realizing it was a career was that I didn't want to do it as a career. But then fast forward, the reason why I quit my day job wasn't because I wanted to be a photographer. The reason that I quit my day job was because I woke up one morning realizing that I 100% did not want to be an engineer anymore. And that even if I didn't know what I wanted to do, I knew for sure what I didn't want to do. And at this point, the plan B was go get an MBA. That would also like make my parents happier because, Asian parents and artists' careers are just generally not that compatible. But I quit in December. You can see this whole thing wasn't that thought through. I kind of missed the hiring, the sort of application cycle. And I was like, well, since I have nothing to do, I'm just going to travel for a little while. And I quickly realized that the best way to travel for free was by teaching, because photography is so location agnostic. And so I would find a photo club somewhere in the world that was interested in what I was doing, ask if they were interested in hosting me. That would usually come with a free plane ticket and then a sofa to crash on. And I would do this presentation. I would make 10 new friends. And out of that, I would have a bunch of new collaborators. And I just kept doing that. I was basically just like nomading from one place to another, depending on where the opportunities lied. And it was it was like a really playful, fun time traveling the world, having like a free sabbatical. The sabbatical just eventually grew into somewhat of a career. Like my sponsorship deal started getting bigger. I started getting paid a little bit more money, and my following continued growing all the way up to some 350,000 followers online. And that
Mm-hmm.
ability to tell stories that were getting seen by people eventually led to work, right? But that was like a 2.5 year journey or so.
And when you're standing behind a camera lens,
Mm.
what do you see that you don't necessarily see in the physical world?
So when I first started out, I still remember the magic of being able to like stand physically in a place, but able to like see the world completely differently. Because when you're looking for a shot, you start paying attention to composition, light, shadows, moments, smiles, emotion, because you're hunting for something. And so that kind of like draws you directly into the present, into details. That's sort of how it transforms the way you see the world. As you get more into like the construction of an image, where I am now, you're creating the scene, you're the world that you wish others would see. You have the
Mm-hmm.
opportunity to design every aspect of that, from lighting to physicality. And I think you think a lot more about the experience that others are going to have. What I'm constantly wondering is like, how do I ignite in people a sense of curiosity? I always like to have something magical where someone looks at it and they're like, where is this person? What are they doing? What am I looking at? Because I think that image that you're creating is all about creating a conversation, generating a bunch of engagement. I do think that holding a camera, it changes the way you see and navigate and interact with the world.
Speaking of that sense of awe and curiosity that you're trying to convey, looking at your earlier works, I was really captivated by the surreal and the dreamlike quality and how you were pushing the boundaries of conventional photography. What were you trying to experiment with at that point in time of your career in order to break out as a professional photographer?
So one of my core values is like kind of curiosity and adventure. Like I just love novelty. I love experimenting. I love exploring. You can see that in my work. It was very, very experimental in the beginning. It was like visually stunning, but like otherwise it was sort of random. Like I'd play with fire for a while. I'd play with costumes for a while. I'd play with special effects for a while. So novelty was a big one. There's also the aesthetic that comes from my upbringing. So when I was younger, I really loved reading science fiction and fantasy work. I think you see that in the work that I create, whether it's through like big epic dresses or really unconventional locations. I was always trying to say like, come into my world. And I think on a more practical level too, I felt like people were more compelled by things that were more different. And so the more weird, the more surprising you can make something, the more chances people would pay attention to it. The truth of being an artist is that you need to create things that people want to see. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to make it. Part of it was also creating things that were popular in order to build a following and be engaging, while also staying authentic and true to like what I cared about. It kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You create this kind of positive cycle by showing people what you want to do that enables others to help you find the next thing, because you're kind of like you're lighting a beacon in the sky and saying, this is what I care about, or this is what I love, and others can find you and then help you along the way.
Well, that's quite exemplary in your first viral piece, which is the underwater shipwreck shoot that you did in Bali about a decade ago. It was a very complex shoot and it took a tremendous amount of teamwork and preparation. Can you just tell us a little bit about how that project came together? I don't want to say too much. I want to hear it in your words.
Yeah. So my parents wanted to drag me onto vacation, and they had chosen Bali as like the destination in Indonesia. And I'm not a big vacation person. I think vacations kind of stress me out because I don't know what to do with myself. There are no parameters. There's no mission. It's just like, be. And I thought, why not get a dive certification? There's a shipwreck. That's really cool. If I need to take some photos there, but like I can't just take photos of a shipwreck. That would be boring because everyone's already doing that. Like I need a model, be a free diver. If then we need a costume. Anyways, one thing led to another. I basically ended up tying a model 30 meters underwater in a shipwreck in Bali, working with this really talented crew of free divers. Chris Simanjuntak was a safety diver who facilitated the photo shoot. One person that I had met who was working at Nike flew in from Singapore for one day just to make a video. And that video ended up going completely viral. It hit like 2 million views. It was published on so many different news outlets at the time. And I still remember just being like, wow, that was completely unexpected. Like, how did I go viral? And I think the one thing that like this project had was that very compelling in words. And so even if I'm a visual artist, how people talk about what you do really matters. And if you can't make interesting for people to talk about, then they're probably not going to do that work for you. That project, beyond the visual beauty of it and the kind of craziness of tying a model underwater, what it taught me was the importance of the conversational aspect of my work and how it could spread with words.
But technically, it was also very challenging because you're tying free divers 30-meter underwater, and there has to be safety divers,
Sure.
and you have, I don't know how many minutes to take the photos, and then the safety divers would come and give the oxygen to the free divers. But how did you find, in terms of convincing people to work with you as a volunteer to fly in from different parts of the world, where the slightest miscalculation could spell some disasters?
Yeah, I think this idea of perceived risk versus actual risk. The actual risk was very low because we had a professional crew of safety divers, and the models are free divers, and they can hold their breath for 3.5, 4 minutes, and so they're very, very comfortable underwater. Actually, the person that is least comfortable underwater is me. I'm just there focused on my photos. I trust the safety divers around. So then maybe the next question is, well, how do you convince the safety divers to come and like support you on something that you've never done before? Well, I already had a portfolio of doing kind of weird and crazy things. They flew over primarily because they had seen that I had created a bunch of fantastical work in the past, and they were interested in experimenting, even if the chances of success were low. And I think that as things build momentum, as you start saying like, hey, we have a location, hey, we have a dive crew, hey, we have like a model, like the whole thing starts to become more and more possible. You're taking something that's just an idea and you're giving it form because you're bringing other people who believe in it. And that like shared belief that something is doable starts to actually transform into reality. Sure, it starts off with just an idea, but as you start convincing more people that it is possible and you start getting the most critical, the hardest pieces of the puzzle down, then the rest of it can kind of flow into place. And I think that's still true today. And I think it's probably what it really means to be an artist, because when you're an artist, you have an idea in your head. And now you just need to convince everyone that that is a good idea. It is a feasible idea. It is a smart idea. It is a marketable idea. And that is really the work. The job of the artist is to help people visualize what they cannot see. And if you can do that, then you can like create a career out of that.
But that's also true for startups, how founders get started.
Absolutely.
They just have an idea to create something, and then they have to go raise the money, build the team, create the product, and build it from scratch.
Yeah, except I think a startup is a far more ambitious project in many ways because you're spending decades building a company. Huge respect for are these corporate visionaries who can see a 20-year thing come into fruition.
From that shoot, you quickly gained widespread recognition. But after working on this very well-paid global campaign, you mentioned in an earlier talk that you felt empty and actually considered quitting photography for the second time, perhaps. Why was that?
For me, becoming an artist by mistake, and because I was doing all these big, elaborate stunts, it felt to me like the most obvious place that I should end up was in advertising and marketing. So I was like, okay, well, if I can become a commercial photographer, that is the goal. But then, of course, being hired by Huawei, which was at the time the second largest cell phone company in the world, to create a global campaign where my face was plastered all over these billboards and getting paid very well for it, I was just like, is this really what I want to do? Is it just spending a lot more time in meetings, in prep, because you have to de-risk the project that you're working on? What was the end goal? The end goal was to create something that was going to sell more product. It just felt kind of pointless if it was just feeding the wallet. And I think one of the reasons why it felt so empty was because I got there so quickly. Like basically within 3 years of quitting my day job, I get this huge project, and I'm just like, what do I actually want? And that's when I started considering like what were the projects I was actually really proud of. And it was always the projects that had some level of social impact. And that became the next North Star that I decided that I wanted to work towards.
So in your search for meaning, you've worked on many projects that didn't have commercial value, but aligned with your artistic vision and values. You worked on the Saving Eliza campaign, which in which you created a viral video for free and raised over $2 million in a GoFundMe campaign for a 4-year-old girl who was diagnosed with a terminal disease. I know that had changed Eliza's life forever because it saved her life. In what way did it impact yours?
The Eliza project was just one of those random bold experiments that I decided to do. So I hadn't made any videos really by that point, but this family said, "Hey, you have experience making things go viral. Do you think you can try to help us make a viral video project?" I mean, they wanted to raise $1 million in a month. And so when I went there, I actually planned to fail. Like I was like recording myself being frustrated at trying to do this thing. And the idea was like, make this video, fail at raising money, and then record the story of what failure looks and feels like, in hopes that might create the successful story. But like it ended up being a success. I didn't even need to fail to succeed in this one. And it was completely unexpected. We ended up being the most funded campain on GoFundMe for like 3 years. And it was such a surreal experience that I just kind of registered it as like an anomalous blip on my radar. It's just like I tied models underwater. I lit some people on fire. I raised $2 million. Like it didn't feel like something that was necessarily going to be a trend. But when I look back on that moment in time, I think what it really helped me realize is that storytelling is a powerful tool, and that an individual can make a big difference and can actually alter the trajectory, not just of an individual, but like of an entire community. That family has grown into the leading foundation that has raised the most amount of money for this disease. And they continue to fight and raise money because a cure hasn't been found, even though Eliza was part of a clinical trial. And so for me, I think it was just about realizing that things are possible, right? Like these, like dreaming big, making a difference, leaning into the power of storytelling. This is something that is like has some meaning and is worth pursuing. And so when I reached that junction point of like wondering, like, what do I do with my life? It became clear to me that at the very least, I should be pursuing something impactful. Like, could I replicate that level of success another time? Probably doesn't even matter. It just mattered that how it made me feel, the pride of saying like, no, I can help people with what I do, I think was really the big unlock, and believing that it was possible.
And so saving Eliza wasn't the only time where you changed somebody's life trajectory. You also managed to surprise Tyler Grace on his 21st birthday.
You've been stalking me.
Yes, just internet stalking. So if you want to watch that video of how Ben delivered himself, wrapped himself in a cardboard box and delivered himself to Tyler's home and surprising him, that's, you can find that on YouTube. And tell us about storm chasing across 7 states and how you became a climate activist.
Yeah. So, we're at this point in my life now where I have a little bit of money in savings thanks to this big job. And I've decided that I want to make a difference in the world. And I really like the unexpectedness of fantasy and how that world building could bring things into my life. And so the question was like, how do I merge these two worlds together? And initially, my idea was to collaborate with nonprofits. I figured that I could take my portfolio, go to nonprofits and say like, hey guys, I'm happy to work with you for free. But it turns out that nonprofits are very risk averse. I'm very experimental. And so there was a mismatch between these two worlds and no one wanted to work with me. It was actually like quite humbling. I realized ultimately that it's not people's faults for not wanting to work with me. They actually have no examples of what is possible when you combine fantasy and impact together. And so it's my responsibility as an artist to show that it is possible. The storm chasing was the first project that I did to raise awareness for climate change. It was actually my ex-girlfriend's idea. She wanted to go storm chasing for fun. And I had a friend who was a storm chaser. And so reached out to him and asked if he could join him on his next storm chasing adventure. And, as we were thinking about what kind of impact could you associate to the activity of storm chasing, she came up with the idea of saying, well, what if we had ordinary people doing ordinary things in front of these big brewing storms, just the same way that ordinary people might be ignoring climate change? Like, what does that look like? Found a volunteer who had an ambulance. In that ambulance, we put all these props and we just picked up volunteers along the way who wanted to model for us. And we just went storm chasing over the course of 2 weeks. And you're like racing these big brewing supercells that are traveling at like 50 miles an hour, and you have to get in front of them through the road network, set up your whole thing, take photos, and then pack everything back up and run away before the storm overtakes you. And I think it's one of the most, yeah, it was absolutely insane experience. But more cool than the photos themselves for me, I think, was just realizing that actually the environment requires a little bit of abstraction and interpretation. And art is really good at that. Climate change, for the most part, is invisible. It's time based. And so you kind of need to apply some level of artistic control to tell that story if you're not just focusing on like devastation. And although from a portfolio perspective, these photos aren't the photos that I think are the most beautiful, they're not the most elaborate. They highlighted the possibility of taking photography and fantasy and impact, and combining that all together. And it just showed me that it was possible.
Right. I was going to say there's a guy sitting on the toilet working against, being swallowed by the storm, right?
For sure,
So,
for sure.
yeah. How many minutes did you have to take the shot?
Like
Was
5
it
minutes.
like 5
you have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. You feel the pressure drop from like minute to minute, and you feel the wind picking up, like all the animals go silent. You really feel really small in these moments. And, we got even caught in a couple hailstorms where, these huge like golf ball sized hail just starts falling out of nowhere. And then you have to like hide they have all these different shelters and like gas stations or whatever. And 30 minutes later, it's like, boom, it's sunny. It's crazy.
Well, since your storm chasing days, arts have definitely become an exploration into the environmental crisis, fast fashion, ocean plastics, and electronic waste, as we had already mentioned. You've also received support from organizations such as Starbucks, Dell, and Nike. And some people may say that these are the same organizations that are spawning overconsumption and creating the problem to begin with. So how do you deal with that paradox?
Yeah, great question. As an artist who likes to do really big, complex, expensive things, the only way for me to make a living is if I take money from those who have a lot of it. So that's like, I guess, the super pragmatic way of looking at it. The other, from a theory of change perspective, is like, I think that in order to move the world from where it is now to where we want it to be, you need to use both the carrot and the stick. And so I'll use the stick doing my own personal projects, calling companies out, or working with organizations like Greenpeace, but then also work with corporations when they do something right. So like, for example, if we just take Starbucks as an example, they switched away from straws. Does that mean that they're still not producing a whole bunch of plastics with their cups? No, it doesn't sort of clean the slate, but it does say like, hey, it's good that we're like removing something from the supply chain that is both unnecessary and hard to recycle. And this is a good thing. So we should celebrate that. And so when I create a piece of art with an organization like Starbucks, they really just gave me some money so that I could pay communities to collect straws for 9 months across the entire country of Vietnam, 168,000 plastic straws, so that then I could hire local builders and fabricators to help build this free art installation that was on display in public, so that I could then take photos, get a Guinness World Record of the parting of the plastic sea, which was like a Guinness World Record art installation out of 168,000 plastic straws. Like, that art piece is used by everyone for free, by schools, by nonprofits, by for-profits. Anyone who wants to talk about how small little decisions add up and how plastics is a problem, they get to use it. I think it's great that brands are funding this kind of work. It's basically creating a public resource out of that money, because we live in an extractive colonial world. And I think the best thing that we can do to honor the money is to create something beautiful and meaningful and giving it a soul, but it isn't done in a way that's like cleaning the slate. So another example was with Dell. They hired me to create a campaign around electronic waste. So yes, they are a big producer of electronic waste. They're also one of the largest recyclers in the world. But for them to recycle e-waste, people need to give them e-waste. There is this dance between these two parties where if ever I can help facilitate and lubricate the wheels of social change in some way, shape, or form, I'm going to try to do it, whether it's the carrot or the stick.
Right. And I think it's also about focusing on the impact, right? The impact that you generate through your artwork, and not necessarily looking at who you're being sponsored by. As an artist, it's probably very difficult for you to measure the impact of your work. You and I have talked about this. I know I struggle with that for sure with this podcast. But how do you measure the impact of your artwork?
For the longest time, I really cared about measuring the impact of art. So much so that I started an entire podcast for a whole year called Impact Everywhere, exploring positive impact in unexpected places. And I like specifically try to ask all these different people who are making a difference in the world, like how they measure their impact. And I was just like, if I can figure this out, then I can sell the impact of art, and like there would just be more artists that were creating impactful work. And I think I landed on the answer that measuring impact was actually the wrong question, at least when it came to art. The closest analogy I can give you is like when we think of like love and relationships, what are the KPIs for you, Jennifer, like that you love your husband? What would you measure? Would you measure like amount of time, moments of contact? We got really good at measuring all of these KPIs. Would we really get to the essence of like what the impact of that love has had on your life? And it just felt like such a dumb question to be asking when you put it on like a human relationship level. So an indicator of impact might be the number of views, the number of organizations making use of the work, the places that it was displayed, the accolades that it's received. You wouldn't actually be able to ever truly know what the impact of the art itself was. Because, you know, as an artist, you're creating work, you're putting it out into the world, and there is no feedback loop. So here's another story, like during the pandemic, and I was just like trapped in my home and I couldn't go anywhere. And I was just like, I cannot contribute to anything. What am I doing? And I receive a Google alert on my email one day for my name. It turns out an entrepreneur all the way in Wuhan, China, called Huang Ningning. Never heard of this girl before. She started a company to create products like bags and shirts out of upcycled plastics. She credited for quitting her day job, in part, the Mermaid on 10,000 Plastic Bottles project that I had created.
Right.
And I was just like, I would have never known that someone's life trajectory was altered in part because of some art that I created. I personally have stopped kind of thinking about that and started focusing my energy more on like, how can I just create something that I think is going to resonate with people? My responsibility is not to do every aspect of the art creation and the impact measurement piece of it. For me as an artist, I'm just going to focus on creating art and hope that it like does a really good job of serving the movement.
I agree with you on that wholeheartedly. I've been reading the Bhagavad Gita, which is the holy Hindu scripture. One of the key lessons is that you have the responsibility to work, but you should not get attached to the results of your labor. Sometimes I'm like, who's listening and how many downloads and how many audience am I reaching like around the world? Having read the Bhagavad Gita made me realize if you do what you feel is right for you, that has an impact, you shouldn't judge your work, whether success or failure or some figure. But I think it's really hard because I'm also very goal oriented. Yeah. I'm also an Asian immigrant.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a dance. It's definitely a dance. But then in terms of your podcast, you know, I was listening to one of the episodes where you're interviewing the founder of Athletic Brewery, who was talking about why he didn't drink anymore, actually like really inspired me. And I ended up, since listening to that podcast, decided to stop drinking. And so I've been sober for like the last 2 months and absolutely loving it. You know, and I think for someone like you on the other end, like if I didn't tell you, you would never know.
Right.
And I would just be one view on your like dashboard. Yeah, it's that one view that really makes a difference. So it's really funny how the systems that we have in place prioritize one kind of success and are completely incompetent at measuring the depth of impact.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about depth of impact. It's really about touching somebody's soul. Like with Tyler Grace and Saving Eliza, you altered the course of their destiny in some way.
Yeah.
So
that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
You know, much of what we had discussed earlier about your artwork is about raising awareness for the climate change and the environmental issues that we have. But you said you also realized that this awareness doesn't equal change or solution. Yeah. And so how do you see your artistic style evolving along that same thread and turning that fear-based narrative to one of hope? People don't like that fear-based narrative because it doesn't inspire them to change.
Yeah. So yeah, my work has gone through multiple stages of evolution. I think when I first started out in 2016, I had this theory in my mind that if only more people knew about the problem, that they would like alter their behavior and change. And if we just take plastics as a microcosm, plastic awareness is at an all-time high, but there's more plastic being produced today than ever before. So our behavior is not matching our awareness. When I take a step back, what needs to change are the underlying systems of incentives. So we need to address things from a systemic and policy level. And so my work when it comes to activism has actually shifted to focus more on systemic change as opposed to individual change. And that means that I'm working with
Mm.
the United Nations and all these different governmental bodies trying to create symbols that actually help the movement. And to your second point on, people being really frustrated with fear-based narratives, I think this is something that I've recently also just kind of banged my head against personally as an activist who is creating all these climate stories. I am getting increasingly depressed because the science only gets worse, and it is
Yeah.
not very encouraging to be part of the losing team. And I think many people in the climate space feel that way, especially if they've been doing it for 5, 10, 15 years. And so, back to this idea of the carrot and the stick, we also need to have something to work towards, something to look forward to. And I think the environmental movement
Mm.
really has somewhat of a crisis of imagination. We know where we want to be in 25 years, but we don't know how we're going to get there, because when we look at the polarization, the misinformation, the big entrenched systems that are keeping us from changing, we get really depressed. And so we struggle to even believe that change is possible anymore. And we kind of just settle into apathy. And so what I want to do with my work as I look towards the future is I really want to start focusing on these narratives of hope. I want to start
Mm.
talking with as many people who work on near future solutions as possible, people who are thinking about justice, equity, inclusion, while also combining that with technological innovation. And how do I make sure that the art that I create can help accelerate that change? Because I think by creating art that helps support a just and equitable transition in a
Mhm.
way that is inspiring and surprising, we can actually help give people hope and momentum and highlight something that we can all be excited to work towards. And then instead of settling into apathy, we can start triangulating on a shared vision for a hopeful and positive future that we can all work towards. And the aspiration, I think, for me, is to first start figuring out how to contribute to this movement, which is called the Solarpunk movement, which
Right.
essentially describes a future in which humanity, technology, and nature coexist peacefully together. And I think when we look at narratives that focus on the future these days in media, it's mostly dystopic, and we need more stories where things are a lot more exciting and beautiful and so forth. And so my goal right now is to start this little solar punk art fund, funding these projects on the forefront of innovation, and hopefully create a model in which that is successful and it can attract and draw new people into that. Because we don't create change alone, we create it together. And whatever I can do to
Yeah.
help spur that on would be really amazing.
I love the idea of the solar punk art fund. I just recently learned from you what solar punk actually means. I think art has the power to create that future where everyone can see the hope and the potential of what we can create together. The challenge for me is how do we create that collective consciousness, because everyone is so polarized today. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I'd love to hear it because I know you think a lot about these things. You're not just an artist, but you're an activist and you're also an engineer and you're a deep thinker.
Yeah, I mean, how do we create a collective consciousness? I I personally feel that one of the greatest tools that we have at our disposal is the ability to be curious. It's really hard to hate someone if you're curious about them. If we can just cultivate more compassion and curiosity in the world for everything and everyone, then we will have a greater ability to navigate these hard and dramatic conversations. I think it's when we cast judgment upon people instead of thinking oh, why do you think this
Mm-hmm.
way? You think oh, you're an idiot for thinking this way. That's when people get shut down. And there's so many studies that have been done, even in a very polarized country like the United States, where we actually most people agree on most things, and it's always the very very loud polarized minority that hijacks our primitive monkey brains and keeps us from seeing each other as people. And while we can't really control the world, we can control ourselves. And so this idea of creating a collective consciousness is maybe just about starting with ourselves, finding those that believe in the same things that we do, who will meet the world in this way, and hopefully try to radiate that outwards to the best of our ability. And I think that's really all we can do.
That's really nice. Thank you for sharing. I want to go back to your art now.
Yeah.
I know it takes a tremendous amount of time, energy, and dedication to bring your vision to life. In addition to the straw apocalypse, your Guinness World Record art installation in Vietnam, you've also built the giant plastic tap using trash from the slums in Kenya, and sculptures made from over, I think, 4,000 tons of electronic waste from Dell, and also the world's tallest closet in Egypt that's over 9 meters and 3,000 articles of clothing. And then most recently, you built a biochar that's over 6.5 meters tall, I think, from 2 tons of bamboo biochar. The list goes on. And it's wonderful to see how the artist, the designer, and the ingenuity in you all come together on these large scale complex projects that takes months to do. But at the same time, I think the audience is wondering, like, okay, what is he going to do next? And so do you feel the pressure to outdo yourself every time?
Yeah, definitely. One of my big fears is fear of irrelevancy. Like, I have something to say, but no one cares and no one wants to listen. What if my greatest successes are behind me? How would I think about my life differently? I mean, these are definitely thoughts, questions, doubts that continuously sneak in, along with just like the real challenges of being an artist doing weird pioneering work that no one really understands. So it is pretty hard. So I just moved to New York in December of 2023 because I had come to the realization that although I have friends all around the world, I don't belong anywhere. I don't have my people, but I haven't invested any time in like building a community or a team. But the hypothesis is that if I'm able to build a community of people that I want to co-create with, where I feel supported and inspired by, that the work will naturally get better over time. And so New York was a place that just felt like it really held that energy, that diversity, the capital, the inspiration, the technical know-how. Like, it really felt like this was a place where I could find everything, or get lost in it, one or the other, we'll see. Instead of trying to pursue success, I have instead decided to focus on how I could cultivate the conditions for success to become inevitable. That was by one of my friends, Vanessa, who gave me that little nugget of wisdom. I'm like, oh, that is wise. I'm going to integrate that into my
That is very deep. Yeah.
Success can how can it not happen if you're surrounded by people who
Right,
inspire
exactly.
you, who are talented and all this other stuff.
What do you think your journey has taught you so far?
I think when you're young, you have this urgency to do all these things, and it's very frenetic. It doesn't matter how much you've accomplished, like new challenges will just appear. And so life is a marathon, not a sprint. How are you going to create the rules that you want to live by to have a meaningful life that you can stick to? I think is really important. And the more you can find harmony, the more pleasant that journey is going to be. I've spent a lot of time just trying to get places and to tick off accomplishments in my box. And these days I still have that ambition to make a difference in the world, but also how to do that more gracefully and more harmoniously.
Speaking of the rules, you want to talk about your golden guidelines?
I feel like that's an entire podcast in and of itself.
That's right. I can post it.
Yeah, I mean,
I can post it on the show
yeah,
notes.
it might be great for you to post a link to the show notes. But long story short, I was going through a challenging time where I was considering like changing careers and like not being an artist anymore, because I was just not sure if the work that I was doing was as effective and if joyful as I wanted it to be. And so I started writing down these like wisdoms and how to prioritize, how to find purpose, and how to like maintain like a generative sort of energetic mindset. And I just ended up creating all these little rules to remind myself in hard times, like what to do. how to perceive the world. And it's evolved into a living document. I keep adding to it over time. But I guess I can just read a few of them that maybe are interesting. One, how do you prioritize things? Demand enough to thrive. If you seek abundance across all your life pillars, it becomes really hard to tell which one to focus on. But if you focus on enoughness instead, do I have enough money to keep creating the art that I find meaningful? Do I have enough community support to create the art that I want to create? So on and so forth. Then enoughness becomes very easy to prioritize because you start figuring out like what you don't have enough of. And by just equalizing the enoughness, you ensure like a healthy baseline. I have something here that's about decisions are not better, worse, or equal. Choices can be both different and correct. And I think sometimes we agonize so hard over making the right decision when really you could have just taken any decision and they're both right. I have something here on finding purpose. It's important to make space for ends in of themselves rather than just doing things that are means to an end. And too often when people are way too goal oriented, they end up making everything about like the destination rather than the journey itself. And it changes the very flavor and texture of the experiences that you live. I have one here about pursuing rejections. So no one likes to be rejected, let's be honest. If your goal is to accomplish 100 successful rejections a year, then you're going to try a lot more things because really success is only a byproduct of rejections. I mean, rejections are mostly the common narrative. And so if we can pursue rejections as a milestone or goal, it can actually make like success kind of inevitable once again.
I love that, by the way. I love that. Pursuing rejection.
That's actually from Brenton.
I have to tell that to my kids.
So yeah, every time I talk to people, I just try to like get little nuggets of wisdoms and integrate them into my own life rules. I have a piece here about like financial archetypes. I had such an unhealthy relationship to money. And so it's been a really interesting journey to deal with my emotional relationship to money and to understand the different financial archetypes that are under there.
I'm also a guardian, by the way.
Yeah, the
money.
guardian. So I've been working a lot on that. I've been working a lot of that.
Yeah,
and it's been so good.
Absolutely.
It's been so great. So the guardian archetype for the listeners is defined by how no matter how much they have, they are scared of losing it anyways. And I think it was very telling to me that like my relationship to money, like my fear of my runway running out has not changed over the last 10 years. And yet like I am so much more stable today, undeniably, like from a numbers perspective. And yet the amount of fear I have for like my runway running out and losing everything is still the same. And it has been so helpful to just know that that is the case and to be able to say, no, I feel the discomfort. I'm going to move past it. Oh, and all it took was like understanding and awareness of like how I am and what I need to like work through has been so healing. So I don't know. I really like my golden guidelines. I would love for everyone to just dive into them and give me feedback for you. And if you have anything to add to it, it's been so fun to like make these rules and dive into them. And every step of the way, you can create whatever reality you want. And so taking the time to just say like, what makes me tick? How can I become the best version of myself? Not just for work, but like as a human, how can I show up the best? It's just a really fun exercise to just sit down and think through.
You're inspiring me to go on the journey to do that, actually. Nowhere as philosophical or deep as yours, I can tell you that. Anyway, we're coming to the end of the episode. I want to ask you, last but not least, question, but not the least, what does the founder spirit mean to you?
I think the founder spirit is to not be scared when inspiration calls, right? So if you have an idea, even if it seems like a terrible one, just pull on that string and don't be scared to play. Don't be scared to experiment. Be curious. I think if you can lean into the curiosity, because you never know where it's going to take you, even if it's the wrong direction, at the very least, it's going to be an interesting one. And I think if there's, I think that the best life that you can possibly live is just an interesting one in which you are learning both about yourself, the world, and your place in that world.
Thank you. We're now coming to the end of our interview. And as you know, we end every episode with a quote. And for this episode, we have a quote from JR, a French photographer and street artist, and also Ben's favorite artist. What we see changes who we are. So Ben, I want to thank you very much for coming on the Founder Spirit podcast today. And let's all imagine a Solarpunk future together where we can live in harmony as humanity, as with nature and technology. Thank
you
you
so much.
If this podcast has been beneficial or valuable to you, feel free to become a patron and support us on patreon.com. That is patreon.com/the founder spirit. And as always, you can find us on Apple, Google, Amazon, and Spotify, as well as social media and our website at thefounderspirit.com. I'm partnering with the Wheeler Institute, a nonprofit foundation focused on accelerating the transition to a net zero economy in restoring planetary health.